The autumn wind carried the smell of frost and turned earth, the kind of smell that told a woman winter was not coming to ask permission. She stood at the edge of the road outside the small settlement of Belle Fleur Crossing in the Wyoming Territory, 26 years old, with $41 folded inside her coat pocket and a list of debts she had no way to pay before spring. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, of resilient women, ingenious underdog farmers, and homesteaders who defied mockery and hardship to build thriving legacies from nothing. The woman you have just met is one of them, though she does not know it yet. She had come west 2 years earlier with her mother, who had died of fever the following summer, leaving her a quarter-section claim along Chicken Creek, a leaning barn, a root cellar dug into the south-facing hillside, and a smokehouse her father had built the winter before he passed back in Tennessee. That smokehouse was the one thing on the property that did not need mending. Its stones fit tight, its door hung plumb, and the channel her father had cut into the hillside drew smoke in a long, slow pull that no freestanding structure could match. She had always believed that smokehouse was worth something. She had not yet discovered exactly what. The sale that October morning was held at Hannigan's feed yard on the west end of town. She had walked 3 miles to reach it, the frost still white on the grass when she set out. What was being sold were breeding sows, 47 of them, big and gray, snouted and slow animals that had spent 8 and 10 years producing litters for the farms around Belle Fleur Crossing and the surrounding county. They were healthy enough, but their days of raising piglets were considered finished. A sow that age was worth almost nothing for breeding. She was worth something for lard, and that was all. And every farmer at that sale understood this clearly. She stood near the back of the crowd and watched the bidding stay low and stay slow. Men leaned on fence posts and made their calculations aloud. Rendering fat, soap, a little salt pork, not much. Not worth the feed to winter them. She was calculating something different. She had read everything she could find about the old smoke-curing methods people used back east before the war. Methods that took weeks instead of days. Methods that used fruit woods and careful temperature, and the patience most people no longer had time for. She had tried small cuts of venison in that hillside smokehouse the previous winter, and had learned what the slow pull of smoke could do to ordinary meat when given time enough to work. What she had tasted afterward had stayed with her all year. A sow that had lived 8 years on creek grass and grain, and whatever she rooted from the ground, had muscle that was layered and dark and rich, in a way that a young hog simply was not. She knew this the way a woman knows something she cannot yet prove. When the bidding stalled at $9 a head and the auctioneer looked bored, she raised her hand. Then she raised it again and again. The men around her exchanged looks. One of them laughed outright. A big man in a canvas coat with a red handkerchief tied at his throat said loud enough for the crowd to hear, "Miss Hartley, you planning to open a circus?" Her name was Margaret Hartley, though she had not heard it spoken with kindness in many months. She did not answer him. She kept her hand up until the auctioneer called the lot sold. She paid $41 and took ownership of 47 retired sows, every last one. The men who had laughed did not offer to help her move them. She had arranged that ahead of time, knowing they would not. A neighbor's boy, 16 and quiet and reliable, had agreed to help her drive the herd the 3 miles back along the creek road to her place for 2 bits and his supper. His name was Samuel Webb, and he was a good worker who asked no questions, which suited her fine. The sows moved slowly, as old animals do, rooting at the roadside grasses and pausing at every muddy low spot to press their broad snouts into the wet earth. She did not rush them. She walked behind the herd in the October dust and let them set the pace, and she watched them closely the whole way. They were in better condition than the bidding had suggested. Their hides were rough but unbroken. Their eyes were clear. 3 of them had slight limps from old injuries, nothing serious. And she noted which 3 and decided those would be first harvested. Not because she lacked feeling for them, but because that was practical thinking, and practical thinking was what this land required of a woman who had no one else to answer to. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. She got the sows through the gate and latched it behind her before full dark, then stood at the fence rail while the boy ate his supper on her step. The herd spread slowly across the pasture, nosing the grass, settling. 47 animals breathing quietly in the October dusk. She could not afford grain enough to keep them properly through to spring unless the plan worked. And the plan required things she had not yet fully tested at this scale. The orchard trees along the east fence were heavy with late apples, the small, bitter kind nobody wanted for eating. She had 2 barrels of last summer's buttermilk already brining in the root cellar. The pumpkins she had grown along the south garden fence were piled against the smokehouse wall, orange and gold and enormous. She had built the pieces of this carefully, one at a time. What she did not yet know was whether they would hold together. The first morning with the herd, she rose before light and carried a half bushel of the small, bitter apples out to the pasture in her apron, walking the fence line and shaking them loose in a long, scattered trail, so the sows had to move to find them. She had read something once in a pamphlet from an Illinois Agricultural Society that she found lining a trunk she bought at auction. It said older animals needed to walk more than young ones, that their fat worked differently when they moved each day. She could not be certain the pamphlet was right, but it cost her nothing to believe it. The sows were not handsome creatures. Their ears were wide and low, their hides pale and blotched, their sides deep and heavy from years of carrying litters. The boy had looked at them with the frank, impolite honesty of a child and said they looked tired. She thought he was right, but tired was not the same as finished. She had been tired herself at 23, working her way west on a wagon with a family that was not hers, doing laundry and mending in exchange for her passage. Tired was something you worked through if you had reason enough. She spent the morning splitting pumpkins along the south fence and leaving the halves cut side up so the herd could smell them and come at their own pace. The oldest sow, the largest one with a notch in her left ear, reached the first pumpkin before the others and stood over it a long moment before she began to eat. There was something deliberate in that animal, something patient that she recognized. She watched her longer than she should have, standing in the cool October sun with her sleeves rolled and her hands sticky with pumpkin, thinking that she understood exactly what it meant to move slowly, but with intention. The buttermilk was the part she was least certain about. 2 barrels was not much divided among 47 animals, and she would need to stretch it, mix it with water and a little of the soured corn mash she had been saving since August. The old-timer she had asked about pork flavor. 2 men at the grist mill in August, both of whom had thought she was asking for someone else, had said the same thing in different words. What the animal ate in its last months was what you tasted in the pan. She had written that down on the inside cover of her almanac, where she kept the notes she did not want to lose. She had also written down the wood combinations she had tested in the smokehouse over those 3 trial weeks. Hickory alone was too sharp. Applewood alone was too faint. But hickory at the bottom of the fire and applewood laid across the top, with the vent barely cracked and the smoke held long and low, had produced something she had not expected when she held a strip of cured pork over a candle flame and tasted it. It had stopped her still. It had tasted like something someone would travel for. She had not told anyone that yet. She was not ready. The first cold front came down out of the north in the second week of October, and she was grateful for it. Cold air meant the smoke held closer to the ground, crept into the hillside smokehouse the way she needed it to, low and patient, unwilling to rise too fast. She had spent 3 days stacking the last of the split hickory against the east wall of the smokehouse and laying the applewood in a separate pile under an old canvas tarp. She knew exactly which log she wanted for the first real cure, not the trial batches, the true first batch. She had selected 8 of the sows for harvest, the oldest 4 and 4 others whose weight had climbed past what she had hoped. The feeding had done its work quietly over the week. The animals had moved slower, slept more, and eaten with the steady, contented rhythm of creatures that had finally been given enough. She did not think about the harvest with any pleasure. She thought about it the way she thought about a hard rain. Necessary, not cruel. Simply what the land required of her. She hired the butcher from the town 4 miles east, a quiet man of about 50, who asked no questions and worked with a cleanliness and precision she respected. She had negotiated his fee down to 2 days of labor in exchange for a portion of the lard, which she knew he rendered and sold at the dry goods store. He arrived before dawn with his cart and his tools, and they worked through the gray morning without unnecessary conversation. By the time the light had gone yellow and low over the western pasture, the smokehouse had its first real load. 8 hams, 14 shoulders, the bacon slabs laid flat on the upper rack, rubbed already with the cure she had spent 4 evenings perfecting. Coarse salt, a small measure of brown sugar, dried sage from the garden, cracked black pepper, and something she had not copied from any recipe but arrived at herself. A light press of dried apple rind worked into the fat side of the slab before the salt went on. She sealed the smokehouse door with the iron latch and stood outside in the cooling air, listening to the first threads of smoke beginning to find the vent cracks. She had done the arithmetic so many times she could do it without paper now. If the hams cured the way the trial cuts had suggested, if the flavor carried through to the full cut the way it had in the small strip she had tested, and if she could get word to even 2 or 3 of the Trading Post regulars before the season turned, she would have enough to pay Mr. Aldous in full before February and still have coin left over for seed. That was the careful version of events, the version where nothing went particularly well, just adequately. She did not let herself think yet about the version where things went better than adequately. That felt dangerous to imagine before the smoke had even had its first night to work. She went inside and put water on for coffee. The coffee boiled before she was ready to drink it, which was the way of things when the mind would not settle. She poured a cup and sat beside the small window that faced the pasture, watching the last pale light drain out of the sky. The sows were quiet now, huddled in shapes she could barely distinguish from the dark earth around them. She had come to know each one by her particular habit. The old one who always slept nearest the fence post, the broad gray who took the longest to rise in the mornings, the one with the notched ear who was first to come to the gate whenever boots hit the dirt outside. They had given their working years to other farms. They were giving her something else now, something those other farms had never thought to ask for. She did not sleep well that first night with the smokehouse running. It was not worry exactly, or not only worry. It was closer to the feeling she remembered from sitting with something living that needed watching. She rose twice before dawn, wrapped her coat around her shoulders, and walked out to press her palm flat against the smokehouse logs. The warmth she felt there was steady and deep, the way a good fire behaves when it has found its rhythm and stopped fighting itself. The hickory was doing what she had calculated. The applewood she had layered in for the last hour before sealing was doing something harder to calculate, but which she had come to trust after the trial cuts. Something quiet and sweet that the hickory alone could not provide. By the third morning she had settled into a rhythm herself. She turned her attention back to the sows, to the root cellar stores, to the small repairs the fence along the creekside still needed. There was always work enough to keep the hands busy, and busy hands had a way of calming what the mind could not calm on its own. She split the last of the pumpkins that had softened too much for long storage and brought them to the sows in 2 heavy trips with the wheelbarrow. She rendered the seeds separately and pressed them into a small cake with grain that would keep her through lean weeks if the need arose. On the 4th day, a wagon came up the road and stopped at the gate. It was not anyone she knew well, a freighter who ran goods between 2 towns to the east, a man she had seen perhaps 3 times at the trading post. He had smelled the smoke from the road, he said, and followed his nose out of pure curiosity. She told him the hams were not ready. He asked how long. She told him. He nodded once, said he traveled this road every 10 to 12 days, and asked if she would be willing to set one aside with his name on it. She said she would think on it. She did not tell him she had already thought on it before he finished the sentence. She watched his wagon roll back toward the road and stood very still, feeling something shift quietly beneath the arithmetic she had been holding so carefully. She went back inside and sat with her ledger open on the table, though she did not write anything in it for a long while. The freighter's visit had changed the weight of the numbers somehow. Before, every figure had felt like a wall she was climbing. Now, the same figures felt more like a fence she was building, each post set with intention, each one proof of progress rather than evidence of how far she still had to go. She had 4 hams hanging in the deepest part of the smokehouse, and 2 sides of bacon she was particularly proud of. The bacon had come from a sow she had let rest the longest before the end, feeding her nothing but buttermilk and pumpkin mash for 3 full weeks. The fat had come through pale and fine-grained in a way she had not seen before, and when she had tasted a thin sliver cured and smoked, the flavor sat on her tongue like something between a sweet apple and a slow autumn fire. She had not told anyone that part. She kept it in the way a woman keeps a good thought, close and quiet until the time is right. That evening she walked the fence line along the near pasture, where the remaining sows had settled into a contentment she found almost companionable. They had come to her thin and overlooked, their usefulness measured only by what they could no longer produce. She had seen something different in them from the beginning, a quality of patience in their large, slow bodies, a willingness to simply eat and rest and let time do its work. She understood that quality better than she could explain. She counted them in the low light. 22 remained in this pasture. 5 had already gone through the smokehouse in the first 2 rounds, and she had processed their results with the same careful attention she gave every step. Nothing had been wasted. The leaf lard was stored in crocks, sealed with cloth and weight. The rendered fat sat in small tins she had traded for at the post. Even the bones had been boiled clean and set out to dry for broth. The orchard at the back of the property held more apples than she had counted on. The tree nearest the fence line was older than any of the others, and its fruit ran small and deeply sweet, the kind that farmers passed over for cider because the presswork was too fine. She had gathered 2 full bushels from the ground alone and was feeding them out slowly, mixing them with the clover she had cut and dried from the low meadow to the north. She thought again about the freighter's single nod before he turned his wagon around. He had not haggled. He had not asked her price. He had simply asked her to set one aside with his name on it, as though the transaction were already settled in his mind before he had even tasted the product. That told her something. It told her she was not the only one who had been waiting without knowing exactly what she was waiting for. The smoke drifted east on a light wind, thin and sweet in the cooling air, carrying itself quietly toward the road. The freighter's name had traveled faster than his wagon, and by the following Thursday, 2 more men had stopped at the gate without being invited, and neither had come purely by accident. One drove a light buckboard from the direction of the river crossing, a merchant by the look of his coat, with careful hands and the habit of measuring things with his eyes before he spoke. He asked whether she had cured shoulders as well as hams, and when she told him the shoulders would be ready in another fortnight, he wrote something small in a notebook he kept inside his vest pocket. The second man said almost nothing at all. He stood at the fence post and looked at the smokehouse the way men looked at a well that had come in clean after 2 failed attempts. He left a deposit without being asked and walked back to his wagon without turning around. She recorded both transactions in the ledger she kept on the shelf above the window. The ledger had belonged to someone else before her, a column of old grain figures still visible on the first 3 pages in different ink. But she had turned past those and begun her own accounting from a clean page. Every figure she wrote was precise. She did not estimate. She had learned early that the difference between what a person imagined they had earned and what they had actually earned was often the distance between staying and leaving, and she had no intention of leaving. The sows were settling into a rhythm that pleased her. They were quieter than younger animals, more deliberate in their movements, and they ate with a kind of steady patience that seemed almost considered. She had begun to believe that older animals carried something in their constitution that translated directly into the flesh, a depth that no amount of time or seasoning could manufacture in an animal that had never lived fully. The buttermilk she poured into the stone trough each morning was a cost she watched carefully, but the color of the meat when she made her test cuts told her it was not a cost she could reduce. The smokehouse itself had required another small repair. The upper vent had shifted slightly after a night of hard wind, and the draw had gone uneven for nearly 18 hours before she caught it. She had climbed the short ladder herself at first light and reset the baffle with a piece of flat river stone she had kept for exactly that kind of purpose. Her hands had smelled of hickory for the rest of the day. She thought about capacity. The structure, as it stood, could hold what it held, and no more. She had already begun to pace out a second chamber against the hill, measuring by boot lengths in the soft earth at the base of the slope. The hillside gave natural insulation. It gave consistent temperature. What it could not give her was time, and time was the one material she could not cure or smoke or press into a longer shape. Word was still moving. She could feel it the way a person feels weather before the clouds arrive, not yet visible, but already certain. The first wagon arrived from 2 counties east on a Tuesday morning before the autumn mist had fully lifted from the creek bottom. It was not a small wagon. It was a freight rig with a canvas cover and 2 broad-chested horses that had clearly been pushed harder than their usual pace. The man driving it had not come to browse. He had come to buy in quantity, and he brought a list written in pencil on the back of a feed store receipt. She stood in the yard and read the list without expression, then told him what she had available and what she did not. She would not sell green product. She would not rush a smoke to fill a single order. Whatever left her hillside had earned its full time in the chamber, and that standard was not a point she would negotiate, regardless of what price he named. He named a price she had not expected. She kept her face steady and told him she would have the quantity he needed in 11 days. If he could arrange return transport, she would have it wrapped and ready at first light. He arranged it. By the following Friday, a second buyer had arrived, a provisioner who supplied 3 Rivertown hotels across a wide stretch of the territory. He was a compact man with careful eyes, who tasted a sliver of the smoked shoulder she offered and stood very still afterward in a way that told her everything she needed to know about the impression it had made. He asked about her process. She described it in general terms: the varieties of wood, the low and patient heat, the feed the animals had received in their final season. She did not describe everything. There were elements of the method that lived only in her hands and her judgment, and she had learned early that a person's careful knowledge was also a kind of resource worth protecting. The provisioner placed an order that required her to look at her curing shed inventory and do quiet arithmetic in her head before she answered. She could meet part of it within 3 weeks. The remainder would require the second smokehouse chamber, which was still only boot-length measurements in soft dirt. After he left, she sat on the low wooden step outside the smokehouse door and looked at the hillside. The measurements were already in her memory. The stone she needed was available from the creek bank. The timber framing was a smaller job than the first chamber had been, because she now understood the geometry of the hill, the way the natural grade handled drainage, and exactly where the vent needed to sit to draw correctly. What she lacked was an extra pair of hands for the framing work. One person could lay stone. One person could notch timber to a point. But raising the frame and holding it plumb while the anchor stones were set, that was a 2-person task, and she had known it from the first morning she paced the ground. She began to think through who she trusted and why, and what she might offer in fair exchange. The answer came to her not as a sudden inspiration, but as a quiet settling, the way a stone finds the bottom of still water. There was a neighbor family 2 miles east, a widow woman and her eldest daughter, a girl who had just turned 18 that past spring, who had helped her carry curing salt from the trading post wagon back in September without being asked and without expecting anything in return. She had noticed that. She noticed most things. She walked over the following morning before the dew had finished burning off the grass. The widow was splitting kindling near the fence line, and when she looked up, there was no surprise in her face, only the calm watchfulness of a woman who had learned to read arrivals carefully. She explained what she needed simply: 2 days of framing work, possibly 3. The anchor stones were already pulled from the creek bank and stacked. The timber was notched and numbered on the ground beside the hill. She needed hands that were steady and a second set of eyes for plumb. In return, she offered 2 full hams from the current cure, a side of bacon, and a standing arrangement. Whenever the widow's household needed pork put up for winter, she would see to the smoking herself at no charge. The widow looked at her daughter. The girl looked at the timber stacked beside the hillside and asked one practical question about the footing stones, a question that revealed she had helped set a structure before and knew what she was looking for. The widow gave a single nod. They began the following morning at first light. The girl worked with a concentration that was quiet and methodical, and the two of them fell into an easy rhythm without needing much talk. She held the frame members while the girl drove the anchor pegs. The girl held the ridge timber while she set the stones. By the end of the first day, they had the primary frame standing and plumb within the margin she needed. By the end of the second day, the smaller walls were in. The interior smoke shelf was laid, and the vent draw had been tested with a small fire of green applewood and found correct. She stood inside the new chamber in the late afternoon and looked at the dark ceiling above her, still smelling of raw stone and fresh-cut timber, and she allowed herself one moment of simple satisfaction before her mind moved forward to the curing schedule, the brine ratios, and the question of whether she had sufficient hickory split and stacked before the cold settled in. She paid the widow that evening, the hams wrapped in clean cloth, the bacon tied with cord, and walked home in the last of the daylight, thinking about numbers. The first chamber could hold 14 sides at once. The second, once she had tested its draw through a full smoking cycle, would hold 12 more. She pulled out the worn paper where she kept her figures and began to write down what the spring could look like. Outside, the first hard frost of the season was gathering itself quietly in the low grass. The frost came hard, as she had known it would, and she woke to a world that had turned brittle overnight. She built the fire in both smokehouse chambers before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, and she stood in the doorway of the first chamber, watching the smoke begin its long crawl across the hanging meat. The hams had been in cure for nearly 3 weeks now, and the color had deepened into something she had only seen in the best of the eastern hams her father had once brought home from a traveling salesman. She did not let herself feel pride yet. She checked the temperature with the back of her hand against the stone, adjusted the vent by a finger's width, and went about her morning chores. The sows that remained in the pasture had grown accustomed to her rhythm. They came to the gate when they heard her boots on the frozen ground, their breath billowing in the cold air. She had 22 left now, and she was feeding them carefully, stretching the stores with whatever she could find. The apples were almost gone, but the pumpkin supply still held. She had buried several of the larger ones in a straw-filled pit behind the smokehouse, and each morning she uncovered one, split it, and scattered the pieces along the fence line. The notched ear sow had taken to following her from the gate to the pit and back, and Margaret had begun talking to her in a low, steady voice as she worked. "You've got more sense than most of them," she said one morning, and the sow looked at her with an expression that seemed almost like agreement. The widow's daughter came by twice a week now, not for pay, but because she had taken an interest in the smoking process. Her name was Eliza, and she asked good questions. She wanted to know why Margaret used applewood instead of cherry, why the vent was set at that particular angle, why she rotated the hams every 4 days instead of 3. Margaret answered each question fully, and in the answering, she found herself understanding her own methods better. There was something about explaining a thing to someone who truly wanted to know that clarified it in the mind. Eliza had a way of standing very still when she was listening, her hands folded in front of her apron, her eyes fixed on whatever Margaret was showing her. She did not interrupt. She waited until the explanation was complete, and then she asked the next question, which was always the right one. Word had continued to spread. The freighter had returned, as promised, and had taken his ham. He had paid without haggling, and had asked for 2 more for the next run. The merchant from the river crossing had come back with a larger order, and the provisioner had sent a letter asking if she could supply a regular quarterly shipment starting in the spring. She had written back with her terms, and she had not lowered them. The letter sat on her shelf now, folded and reread, a marker of how far she had come in just a few weeks. But she knew better than to let it swell her head. The frontier had a way of humbling a person just when they started to feel proud. Not everyone was impressed. The man who had laughed at the auction, his name was Cyrus Webb, no relation to the boy Samuel, had made a point of stopping by the trading post whenever she was there, to ask loudly whether she had managed to sell any of those old bones yet. She had answered him calmly each time, giving him the numbers without emotion, and he had walked away, shaking his head. But the trading post clerk had told her, in confidence, that Webb had been asking around about her methods, trying to learn what she was doing that made her product sell so quickly. She had smiled at that and said nothing. There were things about her process that could not be learned by asking. They could only be learned by doing, by failing, by adjusting the vent a quarter-inch and waiting to see what happened. Those lessons were hers alone. The real test came in mid-November, when a blizzard swept down from the north and buried the valley under 2 feet of snow in a single night. She woke to a world gone white and silent, the wind howling around the corners of the cabin, and she knew immediately that the smokehouse vents would need clearing. She pulled on her coat and boots and waded out into the drifts, the snow coming up past her knees in places. The first chamber was fine. The vent had been set with a slight overhang that kept the snow from blocking it. But the second chamber, the one she had just finished with Eliza's help, had a different vent design, and when she reached it, she found the opening completely sealed by a thick crust of ice and snow. The fire inside had already begun to falter, the smoke backing up into the chamber and curling out through the cracks around the door. She had to clear it by hand, breaking the ice with her fingers until the vent was open again. And then she had to rebuild the fire from nearly nothing, using the driest kindling she had stored beneath the tarp. Her hands were shaking by the time she got the flame going, the cold cutting through her gloves like needles. She fed the fire slowly, adding small splits of hickory, and watching the smoke begin to draw again. It took her 2 hours, and by the time she was done, her hands were numb and her face was raw from the wind. But the smoke was drawing again, and the hams inside had not been damaged. She pressed her palm against the stone wall of the chamber and felt the warmth returning, steady and deep. She stood in the doorway, watching the smoke curl upward into the gray sky, and she felt the first real confidence she had allowed herself since the beginning. Not hope. Hope was something she had carried with her from Tennessee, and it had been tested enough that she no longer trusted it entirely. This was something different. This was the knowledge that she had built something that could survive a storm. She latched the door and walked back through the snow to her cabin, where she built up the fire and sat with her ledger, calculating what the winter would require. She had enough hickory for another month, maybe 6 weeks if she was careful. The apple wood was running lower than she would have liked, but she had found a small grove of wild apple trees along the creek that she had not fully harvested. She would cut those in the spring, when the sap was down and the wood was dry enough to season through the summer. The orders kept coming. By the first week of December, she had a list of customers that stretched across 2 pages of her notebook, and she had stopped taking new orders until she could assess her remaining inventory. The sows were down to 14 now, and she was rotating the harvest carefully, choosing each animal at the peak of its condition. The previous weeks had taught her that an animal that had been fed buttermilk and pumpkin for at least 3 weeks produced a fat of a different quality, pale, fine-grained, with a sweetness that the smoking process turned into something almost like caramel. She had tasted it herself, and she knew it was good. She also knew that she could not replicate it with younger animals, no matter how carefully she fed them. There was something in the years that the old sows carried that could not be rushed or manufactured, but the mockery continued. At the Christmas social at the Bellfleur Crossing Church, she overheard Cyrus Webb telling a group of men that she was running a pig nursery, and that she would be lucky to break even by spring. $41 for a bunch of worn-out sows, he said, loud enough for her to hear. I've seen smarter investments in a losing poker hand. The men laughed, and she felt the heat rise to her face, but she did not respond. She stood by the punch bowl, holding her cup, and she let the laughter pass over her. She had learned that arguing with a man like Cyrus Webb was like trying to drain a swamp by throwing stones at it. It only stirred up the water. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that Webb's mockery was not just idle gossip. He had a reason for wanting her to fail. He owned the largest smokehouse operation in the county, a commercial facility near the railroad depot that supplied cured pork to the mining camps in the mountains. He had built his business over 15 years, using young, grain-fed hogs and a fast curing process that turned out product by the ton. and he had watched with growing irritation as orders that should have gone to him began trickling toward a hillside smokehouse run by a woman with $41 and a herd of retired sows. He had tried to buy her out in early December, sending an offer through the trading post clerk. She had refused without even writing a reply, and that refusal had stung him in a way he did not expect. The next week, she received a visit from the county agricultural inspector, a man named Horace Pindle, who had never set foot on her property before. He arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, riding a sorrel mare, with a leather satchel strapped across his saddle. He said he was conducting a routine inspection of all meat-curing operations in the district. She knew it was not routine. She knew Cyrus Webb had sent him. But she opened the smokehouse doors and let him look at everything. He poked at the hanging meat, sniffed the cure, examined the vents, and asked a long series of questions about her methods. She answered each one calmly, and she watched his expression change over the course of the inspection. He had come expecting to find an amateur operation, something crude and unsanitary that he could cite for violations. Instead, he found a smokehouse that was cleaner than any he had seen in the county, with temperature logs kept in a neat hand, and product that smelled of applewood and patience. He examined the brine barrels, tested the salt concentration with a small glass tube he pulled from his satchel, and nodded once. He looked at the hanging hams, their surfaces dry and firm, the color a deep mahogany that spoke of time and care. He did not find a single violation. At the gate, as he was mounting his horse, he turned back and said, "Miss Hartley, I don't know who told me to come here, but I think I was misinformed about what I'd find." He tipped his hat and rode away. She stood at the gate and watched him go, and she felt something shift inside her. She had passed a test she had not asked for, and she had passed it cleanly. But the knowledge that someone had sent him, that someone was actively working against her, settled into her chest like a stone. She had enemies now. She had not wanted enemies. She had only wanted to smoke meat and pay her debts and live quietly on her hillside. But the frontier did not allow a person to remain hidden. If you built something good, sooner or later, someone would try to tear it down. That evening, she sat by the fire with her ledger open, and she wrote a letter to the widow and Eliza, asking if they would like to formalize their arrangement. She needed help now. The orders were too many for one pair of hands. She would teach them the process, pay them a fair share of the profits, and build something that could not be stopped by a single man's envy. She sealed the letter with wax and set it on the table to deliver in the morning. She also wrote a second letter to the provisioner who had placed the quarterly order, accepting his terms and promising her first shipment by early March. She did not know yet whether she could meet that deadline. She did not know whether the second chamber would hold enough product or whether the remaining sows would carry her through the winter. But she knew that if she waited until she was certain, she would never move forward at all. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the first flakes of another snow were beginning to fall. She banked the fire and checked the smokehouse vents one last time before bed. The smoke rose steady from both chambers, carrying its sweet, patient work into the night. She stood there longer than she needed to, listening to the wind and the crackle of the fires, and she thought about what the spring would bring. She did not know yet that Cyrus Webb had already begun spreading rumors through the county, rumors that would reach the Railroad Commission and threaten her ability to ship her product beyond the valley. She did not know that the blizzard that was gathering in the north would be the worst in 20 years, or that it would test everything she had built in ways she could not imagine. She only knew that the smoke was drawing true, that she had 14 hams hanging in the dark, and that the notched ear sow was standing alone by the fence, watching her with patient, knowing eyes. The letter reached the widow's house by mid-morning, carried by Samuel Webb, who had stopped by for his regular wages and found her sealing the envelope with wax. He took it without comment, tucked it inside his coat, and set off at a trot through the light snow that had fallen overnight. Margaret stood at the window and watched him go, wondering whether the widow would say yes. The arrangement she had proposed was generous, a share of the profits, not just a wage, but it also required trust, and trust was something the frontier did not give freely. She had asked the widow and Eliza to become partners in a business that did not yet have a name, that existed only in the smoke rising from two chambers cut into a hillside, and in the orders accumulating on her shelf. She had asked them to believe in something that was still being built. The answer came before noon. The widow herself appeared at the gate, walking through the snow with a basket of dried herbs and a piece of paper folded in her hand. She was a woman of about 50, with gray-streaked hair and a face that had been shaped by loss and hard work into something that looked almost stern, though it was not. Her name was Martha Lindell, and she had lost her husband to a threshing accident 3 years earlier. She had kept her claim going by sheer force of will, raising chickens and selling eggs and doing laundry for the railroad crew that passed through twice a month. She had not had an easy time of it, but she had raised a daughter who knew how to ask the right questions and set a footing stone level, and that told Margaret everything she needed to know about the kind of woman Martha was. "I've thought about it," Martha said, standing at the gate with her hands wrapped around the basket handle, "and I'll take your offer. But I have a condition." Margaret waited. "I want Eliza to learn the full process, every step, not just the framing and the feeding, but the cure mix and the vent setting and the timing. I want her to know what you know, so that if something happens to you, and I'm not saying something will, she can carry it forward." Margaret looked at her for a long moment, and then she nodded. She had not expected to share her full process with anyone. She had guarded it the way a woman guards the last of the winter flower. But Martha was right. A business built on one pair of hands was not a business. It was a gamble. They started the next morning. Eliza arrived at first light, carrying a notebook of her own, and Margaret began the slow work of teaching. She showed her how to test the salt concentration in the brine by floating an egg, how it should rise to the surface with just a thumb's width of shell showing. She showed her how to feel the vent draw by wetting a finger and holding it to the crack, how to read the color of the smoke and know whether the fire was burning too hot or too slow. She showed her how to rub the cure into the meat, working it into the grain with the heel of the hand, how to feel when the salt had penetrated deep enough. Eliza wrote everything down, but Margaret noticed that she also watched, that she learned with her eyes and her hands as much as with the notebook. That was the kind of learning that stuck. The work grew harder as December deepened. The temperatures dropped, and the snow fell in fits and starts. Never enough to block the roads completely, but enough to make every chore a struggle. Margaret rose earlier each morning to clear the smokehouse vents and feed the fires. And she stayed later each evening, rotating the hanging meat and checking the temperature logs. The second chamber had settled into a reliable draw after the blizzard repair, and she had filled it with 12 sides of bacon and 8 more hams, all from sows that had been fed on the last of the pumpkins and buttermilk. The notched ear sow was still in the pasture, the last of the original 47, and Margaret had begun to think of her as a kind of mascot. She was the oldest of them all, the one who had led the herd to the first pumpkin that October morning, and she had outlasted every one of her companions. Margaret had decided she would not be harvested. She would live out her days on the hillside, eating what Margaret could spare, and she would die of old age when the time came. That decision felt important, though Margaret could not have explained exactly why. But the pressures were mounting. Cyrus Webb had not stopped with the inspection. He had sent a letter to the railroad depot a few miles east, suggesting that Margaret's operation might not meet the shipping standards required for out-of-county transport. The depot agent, a man named Horace Trimble, had written back to Margaret asking for documentation of her curing methods and proof that she had passed inspection. She had sent him a copy of Horace Pindle's clean report, along with a letter from the provisioner that referenced the quality of her product. Trimble had accepted the documentation, but the delay had cost her a week of shipping time, and she lost 3 orders from customers who needed delivery before Christmas. She counted the losses in her ledger and did not let herself dwell on them, but she felt the weight of what Webb had done. He had not attacked her product because he could not. He had attacked her access to the market because that was the one thing he could control. The town of Bellfleur Crossing was small enough that word of the dispute traveled quickly. At the general store, she overheard 2 women whispering about the fuss at the depot, and she saw the looks they exchanged when they noticed her standing at the counter. Mrs. Beeman, the storekeeper's wife, was kind enough to pretend she had not noticed. But Margaret knew that the tide of public opinion was a shifting thing on the frontier. One week, you were the woman who had done the impossible with a herd of old sows. The next week, you were the woman causing trouble for the railroad. It did not matter that she had not caused the trouble. It only mattered that the trouble existed. She began hauling her own shipments to the depot, driving the wagon herself through the snow to make sure there were no further delays. It was a full day's round trip, and it took her away from the smokehouse longer than she liked, but she trusted no one else to handle the product once it left her hands. Eliza helped with the fires on those days, following the instructions Margaret had written out in careful detail, and the smokehouse ran well enough. But Margaret could feel the strain. She was sleeping less, eating less, and her hands had developed a crack in the skin from the constant cold and the salt. She bound them with strips of cloth at night and kept working. The final blow came on the 23rd of December. She had driven a load of 15 hams and 12 sides of bacon to the depot, the largest shipment she had attempted, destined for the provisioners' hotels. She had wrapped each piece in clean muslin, packed them in straw-lined crates, and lashed the crates to the wagon bed with rope that she had tested personally for strength. The drive took 6 hours in the cold, and she arrived at the depot with the light already fading. Horace Trimble met her at the loading dock, his face troubled. He told her that he had received a telegram from the county health board. An anonymous complaint had been filed, alleging that her smokehouse had been operating without a proper curing license. The shipment could not be loaded until the matter was resolved. She asked when it would be resolved. He said he did not know. He said it might take weeks. She stood on the loading dock in the failing light, her breath clouding in the cold air, and she felt something inside her go very still. She had done everything right. She had passed the inspection, kept the records, paid her debts. And still, Cyrus Webb had found a way to reach further. She looked at the crates stacked on the dock, the product of months of work, and she made a decision. She would not leave them there. She loaded them back onto the wagon herself, one by one, while Trimble watched in silence. She tied the ropes, climbed onto the seat, and drove the wagon back toward Bellfleur Crossing in the dark. The road was slick with ice, and the horses were tired, and she did not know what she would do when she got home. She only knew that she would not let Webb's poison take her first real shipment. She arrived at her gate well past midnight, the stars cold and sharp overhead. The smokehouse fires had burned low in her absence, and she had to rebuild them before she could store the meat properly. She worked by lantern light, her hands numb and her back aching, and she did not let herself think about what she would do next. She would think about it in the morning. She hung the last ham, latched the smokehouse door, and walked toward the cabin. The notched-ear sow was standing by the fence, a dark shape against the snow, and Margaret stopped to look at her. The sow grunted once, low and soft, and Margaret felt the sound travel through her like something almost human. She had not cried since her mother died. She did not cry now. But she stood there in the snow, looking at the old sow and the smoke rising from the chamber, and she understood that she was not finished. She would find a way. The next morning, a letter arrived, delivered by a boy on a mule. It was from the provisioner, who had heard about the delay through the railroad telegraph. The letter was short, and it said that if the shipment did not arrive by January the 5th, the quarterly contract would be voided. Margaret read it twice, folded it, and placed it on the shelf beside her ledger. She had 12 days. She had a smokehouse full of product that she could not legally ship. And she had an enemy who was watching from the shadows, waiting for her to break. She poured herself a cup of coffee, sat down at the table, and began to make a list of every person she knew who might help her haul those crates across the county line by wagon, if it came to that. The list was short, but it was not empty. And that, she told herself, would have to be enough. The list she made that morning had 4 names on it: Martha Lindell, Eliza, Samuel Webb, and a man named Otis Crane, who lived 3 miles west and owned a heavy sled he used for hauling timber in the winter. She had no reason to believe Otis would help her, but she had no reason to believe he would refuse either. She folded the list into her pocket and set out before the sun had fully risen, walking through the snow with a determination that felt almost like anger, though she was careful not to let it take hold. Anger cost fuel she could not spare. Martha said yes without hesitation. She said it the way a woman says yes to something she has already decided, before the question is even finished. Eliza nodded beside her, her notebook already in her hand, and asked what time they would start loading. Samuel Webb arrived at the gate by mid-morning, having heard about the depot trouble through the usual channels. He did not ask questions. He simply said he would drive the wagon if she needed him to, and that he knew a route that bypassed the main road, cutting through the low hills to the east. It was slower, he said, but it stayed out of sight of the depot, and it connected to a freight line that ran north to a different rail junction. She looked at him for a long moment, this quiet boy who had helped her drive the Sows home in October, and she realized she had underestimated him. He had been watching her struggle. He had been thinking about solutions, while she was thinking about survival. She accepted his offer. Otis Crane was the harder ask. He was a solitary man, a bachelor in his 40s who kept to himself and did not attend the church socials or the town meetings. She had spoken to him perhaps 4 times in 2 years, and never about anything more substantial than the weather. But he owned a sled that could carry twice what her wagon could, and he had a team of draft horses that were known to be the strongest in the valley. She walked the 3 miles to his place in the early afternoon, the snow beginning to fall again in thin, steady flakes. She found him in his barn, mending a harness by lantern light, and she stood in the doorway until he looked up. She told him everything. She told him about the Sows and the smokehouse and the inspection that had passed clean. She told him about Cyrus Webb and the anonymous complaint and the blocked shipment. She told him about the provisioner's letter and the January 5th deadline. She did not ask for charity. She offered him a share of the profits from the shipment, calculated on paper, and she told him she would remember the debt. Otis Crane listened without interrupting, his hands still working the leather. When she finished, he set down the harness and stood up. He said he would have the sled hitched and ready by dawn. He said he had known her father years ago in Tennessee. He said her father had once helped him when he was down, and he had never forgotten it. She stood in the lantern light and felt something crack open inside her chest. She had not known that anyone in this territory had known her father. She had not known that a kindness from years ago could travel across the plains and find her when she needed it most. She thanked him, and she walked home through the snow with a weight lifted that she had not realized she was carrying. They loaded the sled at first light. The crates were heavy, each one packed with cured meat wrapped in muslin and layered with clean straw. Samuel had brought rope and canvas tarps, and they worked in the gray cold, their breath rising in clouds, their hands moving with the efficiency of people who knew the value of speed. The notched-ear sow stood at the fence and watched them, her head tilted, her ears forward, as if she understood what was happening. Margaret glanced at her once and felt a strange reassurance. The sled was loaded by mid-morning, the crates lashed down and covered. Otis Crane sat on the driver's seat, his hands wrapped in thick gloves, the reins loose in his fingers. Samuel rode beside him. Margaret and Eliza followed in the wagon with the remaining crates that would not fit on the sled, plus a supply of feed for the horses and enough food for 3 days. Martha stayed behind to tend the fires and keep the smokehouse running. It was the 27th of December. They had 9 days. The route Samuel had chosen took them east through the low hills, following an old game trail that wound between the ridges and stayed sheltered from the worst of the wind. The snow was deep in the hollows, but the sled moved well, its wide runners distributing the weight, and the wagon followed in the tracks it left. They made good time the first day, covering nearly 12 miles before the light began to fade. They camped in the shelter of a stand of cottonwoods, building a fire and sleeping in shifts. The cold was bitter, but the tarps and the canvas kept the worst of it off, and the horses were strong. The second day brought the storm. It came down from the north with a violence that she had not expected, the wind rising in gusts that drove the snow horizontal and cut visibility to a few feet. They pressed on for as long as they could, but by mid-morning the trail had disappeared entirely, and the sled was beginning to bog down in drifts that reached the runners. Otis Crane called a halt. He said they would have to wait it out. They found a cut bank that offered some protection, and they unhitched the horses and covered them with blankets. The wind howled through the afternoon and into the night, and the temperature dropped until the canvas crackled with frost. Margaret sat with her back against a crate, Eliza beside her, and she listened to the storm and tried not to calculate what this delay would cost them. The storm broke before dawn on the third day. The sky cleared and the cold intensified, the temperature dropping to a level she had never felt before. The snow had crusted over, and they had to break through it with shovels to get the sled moving again. They were behind schedule now, and she knew it. She did the arithmetic in her head as they rode. They had lost a full day. They had 6 days left, and they were still a day and a half from the river crossing that would take them to the freight line. She did not let herself think about what would happen if the river was frozen solid enough to cross, or if it was not. She only kept moving. They reached the river on the evening of the 30th. It was a wide, slow-moving creek that fed into the Platte, and in normal winters it froze solid enough to bear a loaded sled. But this winter had been strange. The early cold had frozen it thin, and then the recent snow had insulated the ice, and when she tested it with a pick, she found only 2 inches of solid ice beneath a layer of slush. Too thin for the sled, too thin for the wagon. She stood on the bank in the dark, the lantern light casting long shadows across the snow, and she felt the weight of everything she had built pressing down on her. She could not cross. She could not turn back. The provisioner's deadline was 5 days away, and she was stranded on the wrong side of a river that would not hold her. Otis Crane came and stood beside her. He did not say anything for a long while. Then he said, "There's an old crossing about 2 miles upstream, shallower, narrower. The ice might be thicker there." She looked at him, and she saw that he was not offering hope. He was offering a possibility. That was enough. They drove the teams upstream, the horses struggling through the deep snow, the sled lurching over ridges she could not see. The crossing, Otis remembered, was not much to look at, a place where the river widened and slowed, with a gravel bar that came close to the surface. She tested the ice again. 3 inches, still thin, but better. She made a decision. They would cross 1 vehicle at a time, with no one riding. The horses would pull the sled empty, and then she would lead them back for the wagon. If the ice broke, they would lose the sled but not the horses. She explained it to the others, and no one argued. The sled crossed first. The ice groaned and cracked beneath it, but it held. The wagon followed, the horses nervous, their hooves slipping on the frozen surface. Margaret held her breath as the wagon reached the middle of the river, the ice bowing under the weight. She heard a sound like a rifle shot, and a crack raced across the ice behind the rear wheels. But the wagon kept moving and reached the far bank. She exhaled. They were across. They made camp on the far side, exhausted and cold, and Margaret sat by the fire and looked at her list. They had crossed the river, but they had lost another day. It was now the 31st of December. She had 5 days to reach the freight line, load the shipment onto a rail car, and get it to the provisioner. It was possible. It was just barely possible, if nothing else went wrong. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the fire and watched the stars wheel overhead, and she thought about what she would do if she failed. She thought about the debt to Mr. Aldous, and the seed she had promised herself for spring, and the sows that were counting on her to keep the feed coming. She thought about Cyrus Webb, who was probably celebrating the delay, and she felt a cold determination settle into her bones. She would not fail. She had not built a smokehouse and raised a herd and taught a girl to read the color of smoke just to let a man with a grudge take it all away. They reached the freight line on the morning of January the 2nd. The junction was a small station with a telegraph office and a water tower, and the agent there was a man named Granger who had heard of her through the provisioner. He had expected her shipment 4 days earlier, and he had held a rail car open for her, but he said he could not hold it much longer. She thanked him, and she and the others unloaded the crates from the sled and the wagon, carrying them onto the platform by hand. Otis Crane shook her hand before he left, his grip firm and dry. He said he would wait for her at the river crossing on his way back, in case she needed help with the return journey. She watched him drive the sled away, and she felt a loneliness descend that she had not expected. But there was no time for it. The rail car was coupled to a freight train that was scheduled to depart at noon on January the 3rd. She traveled with the shipment, riding in the caboose with the conductor's permission, and she watched the prairie slide past a window, mile after mile of snow and sky. She arrived at the provisioner's town on the evening of January the 4th, with 1 day to spare. The provisioner himself met her at the depot, and he watched as the crates were unloaded. He opened one on the platform, cutting the rope and peeling back the muslin, and he stood in the lamplight and looked at a ham that had been cured for nearly 3 months, fed on pumpkins and buttermilk, smoked with hickory and applewood, tended by a woman who had refused to let the frontier break her. He smelled it. He pressed the surface with his thumb. He took a small knife from his pocket and cut a thin sliver, and he tasted it. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he looked at Margaret and he said, "This is the best cured pork I have ever tasted. I will double my order for the spring." She stood on the depot platform in the cold, the weight of the last 3 months settling on her shoulders, and she felt the tears come before she could stop them. She did not try to hide them. She let them fall, and the provisioner pretended not to notice. She signed the new contract by lantern light, her hands shaking, and she folded it into her pocket. She had done it. She had beaten the deadline and the blockade and the storm and the mockery. She had won. But even as she felt the relief wash over her, she knew that the hardest part was still ahead. She had to go back to Bellfleur Crossing, and she had to face Cyrus Webb, who had tried to destroy her and failed. She did not know what she would say to him. She did not know whether she would say anything at all. She only knew that the smokehouse was still running, and the notched ear sow was waiting by the fence, and she had a spring order to fill. She rode the train back to the nearest junction, then hired a wagon from the station agent to take her the remaining miles. The sky had cleared, and the cold had settled into something steady and dry, the kind of cold that did not cut but simply pressed, day after day, until everything felt brittle. She sat in the wagon bed with her crate of supplies and the new contract folded inside her coat, and she watched the landscape unroll slowly. The same hills and creek beds she had crossed a week earlier, now looking different. She had left as a woman fighting for survival. She was returning as a woman with a doubled order and a reputation that had traveled ahead of her. The wagon let her off at the main road, and she walked the last mile to her gate, the snow crunching under her boots. The notched ear sow saw her from the pasture and came to the fence, grunting a greeting that sounded almost like relief. Margaret stopped and put her hand on the sow's broad forehead, feeling the warmth of the animal's skin beneath the coarse hair. "I'm back," she said quietly. The sow pushed her snout against Margaret's coat and stood still, and Margaret felt a gratitude so deep it almost hurt. She latched the gate behind her and walked toward the cabin, where smoke was rising from both smokehouse chambers. Martha had kept the fires going. The cabin was warm when she stepped inside. Martha was at the stove, stirring a pot of beans, and Eliza was at the table, her notebook open, writing something in her careful hand. They both looked up when she entered, and the silence that followed was not awkward. It was the silence of people who had been holding their breath and had just been given permission to exhale. Margaret pulled the contract from her coat and laid it on the table. Eliza read it first, her eyes moving slowly across the page, and then she looked up at Margaret with an expression that was part wonder and part something else. "Double?" she said. Margaret nodded. Martha set down the spoon and came to the table, and the three of them stood together, looking at the piece of paper that had cost so much to earn. "We're going to need more wood," Margaret said. And for the first time in weeks, they laughed. The next days were a flurry of activity. Margaret took stock of her remaining inventory. She had 12 hams and 20 sides of bacon left in the chambers, enough to fulfill the immediate orders that had been delayed by the railroad trouble. She and Eliza worked through the inventory, wrapping and labeling each piece, while Martha prepared the next batch of cure. The second chamber was running at full capacity, and Margaret began to plan the expansion she had been thinking about since November. She would need a third chamber by spring if she was going to meet the doubled order. She measured the hillside again, this time with Eliza beside her, and they marked out the dimensions with stakes and string. But the town had not forgotten the dispute. Cyrus Webb had been quiet in her absence, but he had not been idle. She learned from the trading post clerk that Webb had been spreading a new story, that her shipment had only succeeded because she had bribed the depot agent, that the quality of her product was exaggerated, that she would not be able to sustain the business through the winter. The clerk told her this in a low voice, glancing over his shoulder, and Margaret thanked him and bought her supplies without comment. She had learned that the best answer to a rumor was not a denial, but a continued existence. She would keep working, and the work would speak for itself. The crisis came in the second week of January. A warm spell moved through the valley, melting the snow and turning the roads to mud. And then the temperature dropped again, plunging to 20 below zero in a single night. The freeze was sudden and brutal, catching the valley unprepared. Water pipes burst in the town. Livestock that had been brought through the warm spell without shelter perished in the cold. And in the farming communities around Bellfleur Crossing, the hog farmers who had followed conventional methods, who had raised their young pigs on grain and kept them in open pens, lost nearly half their herds. The pigs were not old enough to withstand the sudden cold, and the grain stores had been depleted by the warm spell, leaving the animals weak. Cyrus Webb's operation was hit the hardest. He had been expanding, buying young feeder pigs from the surrounding counties, planning to fatten them through the winter and sell them in the spring. He had built his business on quantity, on fast turnover, on the assumption that the weather would hold. When the freeze came, he lost over 100 pigs in a single night. The carcasses were piled outside his barn, frozen solid, a monument to his miscalculation. He had been so focused on undermining Margaret's operation that he had neglected his own. The irony was not lost on the town. Margaret's herd, on the other hand, emerged from the freeze unscathed. The notched-ear sow and the remaining 14 had been living on the hillside through the worst of the winter, feeding on the pumpkins and buttermilk that Margaret had stored, sheltering in the lee of the smokehouse where the heat from the fires kept the ground thawed. They were old animals, hardened by years of living rough, and they had a resilience that the young pigs did not. Margaret walked out the morning after the freeze and found them huddled together, their breath rising in clouds, but alive. She counted them twice to be sure. All 14. She leaned against the fence and felt a wave of relief so strong it made her knees weak. The mood in Bellfleur Crossing shifted. Men who had laughed at Margaret's purchase of the old sows now came to her gate, asking if she had any to sell. She told them no. She told them she was keeping her herd for breeding, that she planned to raise her own feeder pigs from the old stock, and that she would have piglets available in the spring. The men left disappointed, but they did not argue. They could not argue with results. Even the most stubborn among them had to admit that the woman with the old sows had come through the winter stronger than anyone else. Cyrus Webb did not come to her gate, but she heard from Samuel that he had been seen at the bank, trying to secure a loan to rebuild his herd, and that the bank had turned him down. The loss of the pigs had been too great, and his credit was stretched thin. He had overextended himself, and now he was paying the price. Margaret felt no satisfaction in this. She had not wanted him to fail. She had only wanted to succeed herself. But the frontier did not offer clean outcomes. Every success was built on someone else's failure, and every failure was a lesson that someone else would learn. She stood on the hillside at the end of January, looking out over the valley. The snow was deep, but the days were growing longer, and she could feel the spring waiting beneath the cold crust. She had 14 sows, 2 working smokehouses, a doubled contract, and a list of customers that stretched across 3 pages of her ledger. She had a partner in Martha and an apprentice in Eliza. She had a boy who was loyal and a man who had remembered a kindness from years ago. She had built something real, and it was growing. But she knew, standing there in the fading light, that the hardest test was still to come. Cyrus Webb had not given up. He was wounded, but wounded men were dangerous, and somewhere in the dark of the winter he was planning his next move. She did not know what it would be, but she knew it would come. She pulled her coat tighter and walked back down the hill, toward the smokehouse and the steady warmth of the fires. The notched-ear sow followed her to the gate and stood watching as she latched it behind her. The smoke rose thin and straight into the still air, carrying the promise of what was yet to come. The final crisis came in the middle of February, not with a storm, but with a silence. The railroad line that connected Bellfleur Crossing to the outside world had been shut down by a washout 50 miles east, where an ice dam had broken and swept away a quarter-mile of track. The telegraph wires went dead the same day. The town was cut off, and no one knew how long it would last. The general store's shelves began to empty. The feed stores rationed grain, and the farmers who had lost their pigs in the January freeze found themselves with nothing to sell and nothing to eat but what they had put up in the fall. Margaret's smokehouse had been running steadily through the weeks since her return. She had fulfilled the provisioner's doubled order with the last of the original sows, shipping it on the final train before the line went dead. The crates had gone out with a day to spare, and the payment had arrived by telegram just before the wires fell silent. She had cash in hand, enough to pay Mr. Aldous and still have a stake for spring seed. But the isolation brought new pressure. The town had no meat. The hunters who went out into the hills came back empty-handed, the wildlife driven deep by the cold. The families that had not put up enough stores in the fall began to go hungry. Margaret had 14 sows left, the breeders she had kept for spring farrowing, and she had a small surplus of cured meat from the last batch, 6 hams, and 10 sides of bacon that she had been saving for her own use and for Martha and Eliza. She could have sold them at inflated prices. The scarcity would have justified it, but she did not. She opened her gate to the families who came asking, and she sold the meat at the same price she had always charged, no more. She gave 2 hams to the widow who lived alone on the North Road, whose husband had died in the freeze. She gave a side of bacon to the family with 5 children who had lost their pig to the cold. She did not tell anyone she was doing this. She simply did it, and word spread anyway. Cyrus Webb was not among those who came to her gate. His operation was in ruins. The pigs he had lost were piled behind his barn, and the bank had refused him a loan to rebuild. His smokehouse sat empty, its fires cold, its racks bare. He had spent years building a reputation as the most successful meat curer in the county, and in a single winter it had crumbled. He took to drinking at the saloon, a thing he had never done before, and the townspeople who had once laughed at Margaret now laughed at him. It was not kind laughter. But the frontier was not kind. The turning point came on a Sunday, at the church. The service had ended, and the congregation was gathered in the yard, talking in low voices about the shortage and the railroad, and what they would do if the line did not reopen soon. Margaret stood near the fence, her hands in her coat pockets, speaking with Martha and Eliza. She saw Cyrus Webb across the yard, standing alone, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished. Their eyes met for a moment, and he looked away. Then the minister, Reverend Holcomb, called for everyone's attention. He stood on the church steps, and he spoke about the hardship the community was facing, and about the people who had stepped forward to help. He mentioned Margaret by name. He said that she had given meat to families who could not afford it, that she had sold at fair prices when she could have charged anything, that she had built something from nothing and had used it to sustain others. The congregation turned to look at her. There was a silence, and then someone began to clap. Others joined. Margaret stood still, her face warm despite the cold, and she did not know where to look. And then Cyrus Webb stepped forward. He walked through the crowd, and the clapping faltered as people turned to watch him. He stopped in front of Margaret, and the silence that fell was absolute. He stood there for a long moment, his hands at his sides, his face red from the cold or from something else. Then he spoke, his voice rough and low, the first words he had ever spoken directly to her. "Miss Hartley, I was wrong about you. I was wrong from the beginning, and I have been trying to tear you down because I was too proud to admit it." He paused, and she saw him swallow. "I lost my herd because I was focused on you instead of my own fences, and while I was losing everything, you were feeding people who needed feeding. I don't have anything left to offer you but an apology, but I am offering it. I am sorry." The wind moved through the churchyard, carrying the sound of his voice away. Margaret looked at him, this man who had sent an inspector to her door and blocked her shipment and spread rumors through the town, and she saw something she had not expected. She saw a man who had been broken by his own pride, standing in front of everyone, admitting it. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel anger. She felt something closer to the quiet satisfaction that came when a difficult piece of work was finally finished. "Thank you, Mr. Webb," she said, and she meant it. The crowd began to murmur, and Reverend Holcomb stepped down from the church steps and shook Margaret's hand. Others came forward. She nodded to each of them, accepted their gratitude, and then she excused herself and walked home through the snow. The notched-ear sow was waiting at the gate, as she always was, and Margaret stopped and put her hand on the old animal's head. She stood there for a long time, looking at the smoke rising from the chambers, feeling the warmth of the sow beneath her palm, and she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had come west with $80 and a trunk of tools. She had bought animals that no one wanted. She had been laughed at and blocked and tested by storm and river and ice. And she had built something that could not be torn down, not by a man's envy, or a winter's fury, or a railroad's failure. The railroad reopened in the first week of March. The telegraph wires came back to life, and the provisioners' first quarterly payment arrived, exactly as promised. Margaret used part of it to pay Mr. Aldous in full, and she used the rest to buy fencing and feed for the spring farrowing. The notched-ear sow gave birth to a litter of 12 piglets on the first warm day of the year, and Margaret sat on a stool in the barn and watched them nurse, their small bodies curling against the old sow's flank. She had kept her promise. The old sow would live out her days on the hillside, and her bloodline would carry forward into the new herd. She built the third smokehouse chamber in April, with help from Eliza and Martha and Otis Crane. Samuel Webb came too, and even Cyrus Webb showed up one morning, carrying a load of split hickory he had cut from his own woodlot. He did not say much. He stacked the wood and left. But the gesture was noted. On the evening the third chamber was finished, Margaret walked to the top of the hill behind the smokehouse and looked out over the valley. The creek was running high with meltwater. The orchard trees were beginning to bud. The sows were grazing in the pasture, their piglets tumbling in the grass. The smoke rose from 3 chambers now, thin and straight into the April air, carrying the sweet, patient work of her hands out across the valley. She stood there until the light began to fade, and then she turned and walked back down the hill. The notched-ear sow was waiting at the gate, as she always was. Margaret reached out and touched the old animal's ear, the notch that had marked her from the beginning. "Thank you," she whispered. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.